The sun hung low in the sky over Arcturus 7, casting long shadows across the barren landscape. The planet was not a welcoming place. Its red soil stretched endlessly, broken only by jagged rocks and dry riverbeds that hadn't seen water in centuries. Despite its harshness, humanity had claimed it as one of their first colonies beyond Earth's solar system. It was supposed to be a new beginning, a chance to prove that humans could survive anywhere, even on the edge of known space. But now, things were falling apart. Jacob stood at the edge of the colony's main dome, staring out at the desolate horizon. His hands rested on the railing, gripping it tightly as if trying to hold on to something stable in a world that felt like it was crumbling around him. He was a tall man with broad shoulders, though his frame seemed smaller now after months of stress and sleepless nights. His dark hair was streaked with gray, and deep lines etched into his face told the story of too many burdens carried alone. Behind him, inside the dome, people moved about with quiet urgency. They were hauling crates of supplies, repairing equipment, or tending to the sick. The colony's population had dwindled since the outbreak began. What started as a few isolated cases quickly spiraled into an epidemic. A strange illness swept through the settlement, leaving victims weak and feverish, their bodies unable to fight whatever alien pathogen had taken hold. No one knew where it came from or how to stop it. Food was another problem. The crops they'd planted refused to grow properly in the thin, nutrient-poor soil. Supplies shipped from Earth were delayed or worse, lost entirely during transit. Rations were cut weeks ago, and tempers were running short. Arguments erupted daily over trivial matters, and morale was at an all-time low. Jacob could feel the weight of it pressing down on him every time he looked into someone's eyes. "We need help," he muttered under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. But who could they call? Earth was light years away, and communication delays made any kind of meaningful dialogue impossible. Even if they sent a message, it would take weeks, maybe months, for a response to arrive if it arrived at all. By then, it might be too late. Emily sat hunched over her console in the communications hub, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She wasn't much older than 30, but exhaustion had aged her considerably. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a messy ponytail, and dark circles ringed her blue eyes. Still, she worked tirelessly, determined to find some kind of solution. "Come on," she whispered to herself, squinting at the screen. "There has to be someone out there." She had spent hours scanning nearby star systems, looking for any sign of intelligent life. Humanity wasn't alone in the galaxy, that much was certain, but most civilizations either ignored them or viewed them with suspicion. Reaching out blindly was risky, but what choice did they have? Staying silent meant waiting to die, and Emily didn't plan on giving up without a fight. After what felt like forever, she found something. A faint signal emanating from a distant cluster of stars. It wasn't much, just a blip on her radar, but it was enough to give her hope. Carefully, she adjusted the frequency of their transmitter, aiming it toward the source. Then, taking a deep breath, she pressed the button. "This is Colony Arcturus 7, requesting immediate assistance. We are facing a critical situation and require aid. Please respond if you can hear us." Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke, but she forced herself to sound calm and confident. When she finished, she leaned back in her chair and waited. Seconds ticked by, then minutes. Nothing happened. Just static. Disappointment washed over her, but she refused to give up. She repeated the message, tweaking the frequency each time in case the signal wasn't reaching far enough. Hours passed, and still there was no reply. Finally, she slumped forward, resting her forehead against the cool metal of the desk. "I'm sorry," she murmured, though no one was there to hear her. "I tried." Little did she know, her message had been heard not by friendly ears, but by something far more dangerous. Far beyond the reaches of human exploration, in a part of the galaxy untouched by Earth's influence, a group of beings, known as the Deathworlders, received the transmission. They were a hardy species, adapted to survive on planets so hostile that most life forms couldn't last more than a few minutes. Their bodies were encased in thick exoskeletons, their limbs tipped with razor-sharp claws. They were warriors by nature, bred for combat and survival. When the distress signal reached them, they listened intently. At first, they thought it might be some kind of trick or clever ploy by a rival faction to lure them into a trap. But as they analyzed the message, they realized it wasn't a challenge. It was a cry for help. Kale, the leader of the Deathworlder contingent, frowned as he considered the implications. His sharp, angular features twisted in thought, and his glowing yellow eyes narrowed. To him, this was not a simple request for aid. It was an intrusion, an act of aggression disguised as weakness. How dare these unknown creatures invade their territory and demand assistance? "We will investigate," he growled, his voice low and guttural. Around him, his warriors nodded in agreement, eager for the chance to confront whatever threat lay. Ahead. Without hesitation, Kale ordered his fleet to prepare for departure. Their ships were sleek and menacing, designed for speed and efficiency. Within moments, they were hurtling through space, following the trail of the mysterious signal. None of them knew what awaited them at their destination, but they were ready. For anything. Back on Arcturus 7, life continued its slow descent into chaos. Jacob walked among the colonists, offering words of encouragement whenever he could. Some listened. Others barely acknowledged his presence. He stopped near a group of children playing in the dirt, their laughter momentarily lifting the gloom that hung over the settlement. For a brief second, he allowed himself to smile. Nearby, Daniel tinkered with a damaged piece of machinery, muttering under his breath as he worked. He was a wiry man with close-cropped brown hair and grease-stained hands. Though not officially trained as an engineer, he had a knack for fixing things, and the colony relied heavily on his skills. Right now, he was trying to repair a water purification unit that had broken down days earlier. Without it, their already limited supply of clean water would run out even faster. Rachel approached him, carrying a stack of papers filled with notes and diagrams. She was slender and soft-spoken, with curly auburn hair and glasses perched on her nose. As the colony's linguist, she had been tasked with studying the local environment in hopes of finding clues about the illness. So far, her efforts had yielded little success. "Any luck?" she asked, setting the papers down beside him. Daniel shook his head. "Not yet. This thing is ancient." "I don't know why we even brought it along," Rachel sighed. "We'll figure it out. We have to." As the two of them talked, Emily entered the room. Her expression was grim, and she held a datapad clenched tightly in her hand. Jacob noticed her immediately and crossed the distance between them. "What is it?" he asked, concern evident in his tone. Emily hesitated before speaking. "I sent out a wideband distress signal. It's our only shot, Jacob. If there's anyone out there willing to help, they'll hear us." Jacob's jaw tightened. Sending such a message was risky. It could attract attention from hostile forces, just as easily as allies, but what other options did they have? He nodded slowly. "Good work, Emily. Let's hope it pays off." Unbeknownst to any of them, their plea for help had indeed been answered. And soon the consequences of that decision would become painfully clear. Days turned into weeks, and the colonists grew increasingly desperate. Food rations were nearly depleted, and the number of sick continued to rise. Tempers flared, and arguments broke out more frequently. Jacob did his best to keep everyone focused, but even he was starting to lose hope. Then, one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky above the colony lit up with a series of bright flashes. Everyone froze, staring upward in awe and fear. Massive ships descended from the heavens, their metallic surfaces glinting ominously in the fading light. They were unlike anything the colonists had ever seen, angular and brutal in design. Exuding an aura of raw power, panic spread like wildfire. People scrambled for cover, shouting and screaming as the ships landed outside the dome. From within, towering figures emerged, clad in armor-like exoskeletons and armed with fearsome weapons. The Deathworlders had arrived. Jacob stepped forward, cautiously, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. Behind him, Emily and Rachel exchanged worried glances, while Daniel clutched a wrench like it might somehow protect him. The air was thick with tension as Kale strode toward them, his piercing gaze sweeping over the frightened humans. You dare trespass on our domain? He snarled, his voice reverberating like thunder. Explain yourselves. Jacob swallowed hard, searching for the right words. We didn't mean to intrude. We're just trying to survive. Please, we need your help. Kale's expression remained impassive, unreadable. For a moment, it seemed like he might strike Jacob down where he stood. But instead, he gestured for his warriors to stand down. Survival, he said, almost as if tasting the word. We understand survival. And with that, the standoff began, a fragile, uneasy meeting between two vastly different species, each struggling to comprehend. The air was thick with tension as Kale and his warriors stood face to face with the humans. Jacob tried to keep his voice steady, but his hands trembled slightly as he raised them in a gesture of peace. The towering Deathworlders loomed over. The colonists, their glowing eyes scanning the frightened faces around them. Their claws gleamed under the dim light of Arcturus 7's setting sun, and their armor-like exoskeletons made them look invincible. We didn't mean to invade your territory, Jacob said slowly, choosing his words carefully. We're just trying to survive. Our colony is dying. We sent out a signal hoping someone would help us. Kale tilted his head, studying Jacob with an unreadable expression. His sharp features and glowing yellow eyes gave him an intimidating presence, but there was something else in his gaze, curiosity, perhaps, or suspicion. He didn't respond immediately, instead turning to one of his warriors, who handed him a small device. It hummed softly as Kale held it up, pointing it toward Jacob. This device translates your speech, Kale growled, his voice deep and gravelly. Speak again. Jacob nodded nervously, glancing at Emily and Rachel, who stood nearby. Both women looked pale but determined. Taking a deep breath, Jacob spoke again. We are not your enemies. We're just settlers from Earth. We came here to build a new home, but things have gone wrong. Our crops won't grow, our people are sick, and we don't have enough food. We need help. Kale listened intently, his glowing eyes narrowing as the translation device processed Jacob's words. When it finished, he let out a low rumble that sounded almost like a growl. Your signal reached us, he said finally. But it was unclear. We thought you were declaring war. Emily stepped forward cautiously, her heart pounding. She had been monitoring communications when the distress signal was sent, and she felt responsible for this misunderstanding. It wasn't a declaration of war, she said firmly, though her voice wavered slightly. It was a cry for help. We never meant to offend you. Kale turned his piercing gaze on her, studying her closely. Emily forced herself to meet his eyes, even though every instinct told her to look away. After a long moment, Kale lowered the translation device and gestured for his warriors to stand down. If you are telling the truth, he said, then explain why your kind sent such a signal into space without knowing who might hear it. Rachel, who had been quietly observing the exchange, stepped forward next. Her voice was soft but steady. We're explorers, she said. We're still learning about the galaxy. We didn't know this area belonged to anyone. We thought it was empty. Kale's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, perhaps surprise, or maybe disbelief. He turned to his warriors, exchanging a few guttural words in their native language. Whatever they said, it seemed to calm the tension among them. Slowly, the Deathworlders lowered their weapons. Though they remained alert and watchful, Jacob let out a shaky breath, feeling a glimmer of hope for the first time in days. So, will you help us? He asked hesitantly. Kale studied him for a long moment before responding. Help is not freely given, he said. You must prove yourselves worthy of it. The next few hours were tense and chaotic. The Deathworlders set up a perimeter around the colony, refusing to allow anyone to leave or enter without their permission. They moved with precision and efficiency, their movements fluid despite their bulky frames. Inside the dome, the colonists gathered in small groups, whispering nervously about what might happen next. Emily stayed close to the communication hub, keeping an eye on the monitors in case any new signals came through. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the Deathworlders' arrival. They weren't acting like typical invaders. They weren't destroying buildings or taking supplies, but they weren't exactly friendly either. Their Behavior was cautious, almost wary, as if they expected the humans to turn on them at any moment. Daniel, meanwhile, worked tirelessly to repair the damaged water purification unit. With the colony's clean water supply running dangerously low, it was one of their top priorities. He crouched beside the machine, his hands moving quickly as he adjusted wires and replaced faulty components. Sweat dripped down his forehead. But he didn't stop. Every second counted. Rachel joined him after a while, holding a clipboard filled with notes. "How's it going?" she asked, kneeling beside him. "Slowly," Daniel muttered, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. "This thing is ancient. I'm surprised it lasted this long." "Well, it has to last a little longer," Rachel said firmly. "We can't afford to lose it now." As they worked, Kale and a small group of Deathworlders entered the dome. Their presence sent a ripple of fear through the colonists, but no one dared to confront them. Kale's glowing eyes scanned the room, taking in the makeshift hospital beds, the piles of empty ration crates, and the weary faces of the settlers. He stopped near Jacob, who was helping distribute food to the sick. "You claim your colony is dying," Kale said abruptly. "Show me." Jacob hesitated, then nodded. "Follow me." He led Kale and his warriors to the medical bay, where dozens of colonists lay on cots, their faces pale and gaunt. Some coughed weakly, while others stared blankly at the ceiling, too weak to move. A young doctor named Sarah rushed between patients, checking vitals and administering medication. Though it did little to ease their suffering, Kale observed silently, his expression unreadable. After a moment, he turned to one of his warriors and gestured toward a nearby patient. The warrior stepped forward, extending a clawed hand toward the sick man. Jacob tensed, ready to intervene, but Kale raised a hand to stop him. "Do not interfere," Kale ordered. "We must understand your illness." The warrior placed his claw gently on the man's forehead, closing his eyes as if concentrating. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the warrior let out a low hiss and pulled back, shaking his head. "Foreign pathogen," he said in his guttural language. "Not natural." Kale nodded thoughtfully. "Explain," he said, turning to Jacob. "It started a few weeks ago," Jacob said quickly. "At first, it was just a few people getting sick, but then it spread. We don't know where it came from or how to stop it." Kale frowned, his sharp features twisting in thought. "This disease, it threatens all of you?" "Yes," Jacob admitted. "If we don't find a cure soon, none of us will survive." Kale was silent for a long moment, his glowing eyes fixed on Jacob. Finally, he spoke. "We will consider your request for aid. But know this: if you deceive us, there will be consequences." With that, he turned and left the medical bay, his warriors following close behind. Jacob watched them go, feeling a mix of relief and unease. On one hand, the Deathworlders hadn't attacked them outright, which was a good sign. On the other hand, their intentions remained unclear. Were they truly considering helping, or were they just biding their time? Later that evening, the colony gathered in the main hall for a meeting. Jacob stood at the front, addressing the crowd. "I know this situation is frightening," he began, his voice carrying across the room. "But we have to stay calm. The Deathworlders haven't harmed us yet, and they seem willing to listen." "That's more than we could have hoped for." Emily nodded in agreement. "They've already started analyzing the disease," she added. "One of their warriors examined a patient earlier and identified it as a foreign pathogen. Maybe they can figure out how to stop it." Daniel crossed his arms, looking skeptical. "Even if they do, we still have other problems. Food, water, supplies, we're running out of everything. What happens when those run out? Are we supposed to rely on them for everything?" Rachel stepped forward, her voice firm. "We don't have a choice right now. If they can help us survive, we need to accept their help at least until we're stable enough to stand on our own." The room fell silent as the colonists considered her words. No one liked the idea of depending on the Deathworlders, but none of them could deny the reality of their situation. Without help, they wouldn't last much longer. As the meeting ended, Jacob approached Emily privately. "Do you think they'll really help us?" he asked quietly. Emily hesitated, then shrugged. "I don't know. but I think they're curious about us. That might be enough to buy us some time. Jacob sighed, rubbing his temples. Let's hope so. Because if they decide we're not worth saving. He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Emily understood. If the Deathworlders turned against them, the colony wouldn't stand a chance. Over the next few days, the Deathworlders began exploring the colony in greater detail. They inspected the agricultural domes, tested soil samples, and studied the colony's infrastructure. Their methods were efficient but invasive, and many colonists grew uneasy under their watchful eyes. Still, there were moments of unexpected cooperation. One afternoon, Daniel found himself working alongside a Deathworlder named Vorn, who had taken an interest in the colony's machinery. Vorn was shorter than most of his kind, with a leaner build and a more agile demeanor. He moved with a quiet intensity, examining the equipment with sharp, calculating eyes. "You fix things well," Vorn said gruffly, pointing to the water purification unit Daniel had repaired earlier. "Why not use stronger materials?" Daniel blinked, surprised by the question. "Stronger materials are expensive," he explained. "We had to make do with what we brought from Earth." The fragile peace between the humans and the Deathworlders was about to be tested. Days had passed since Kale and his warriors arrived, and while there hadn't been outright hostility, trust remained thin on both sides. The colonists were wary of the towering armored figures who moved through their settlement like shadows. Meanwhile, the Deathworlders kept their distance, observing the humans with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. Jacob tried to stay optimistic, but it was becoming harder with each passing day. Supplies were running dangerously low, and though the Deathworlders had offered some assistance, it wasn't enough to solve the colony's problems. Food rations were stretched to the breaking point, and the alien disease continued to spread. Every morning, Jacob woke up dreading the thought of losing another settler to sickness or starvation. Emily spent most of her time in the communications hub, monitoring transmissions from the Deathworlders' ships. She didn't fully understand their language, but she could sense tension in their voices whenever they spoke among themselves. Something was bothering them, something they weren't sharing with the humans. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emily noticed an unusual spike in activity aboard one of the Deathworlder vessels. Her screen lit up with data as sensors detected a sudden surge of energy. Frowning, she adjusted the frequency and zoomed in on the readings. That's when she saw a massive fleet appearing on the edge of Arcturus 7's star system. Dozens of ships, larger and more advanced than anything the Deathworlders had brought with them. Her heart raced as she scrambled to analyze the incoming vessels. They weren't broadcasting any identification signals, which meant they weren't here for friendly purposes. Whoever they were coming fast. "Jacob!" Emily shouted, rushing out of the communications hub. "We've got trouble." Jacob looked up from where he was helping distribute the last of the water rations. His face paled as Emily explained what she had seen. Without wasting a moment, he called an emergency meeting with Kale when Jacob and Emily reached the main dome. Kale was already there, standing near a group of his warriors. His glowing yellow eyes narrowed as Jacob approached. "What is it?" he demanded, his voice sharp. "There's a fleet heading this way," Jacob said quickly. "It just appeared at the edge of our system. We don't know who they are, but they're big and they're moving fast." Kale's expression darkened. He turned to one of his warriors and barked a command in their guttural language. The warrior nodded and hurried off, presumably to verify the information. Moments later, Kale received confirmation via his own communication device. His jaw tightened as he processed the news. "They are not of our kind," Kale growled, "and they do not come in peace." The room fell silent as the weight of his words sank in. If the Deathworlders were worried, then the situation must be dire. Jacob exchanged a glance with Emily, who looked as frightened as he felt. "What do we do?" Jacob asked, his voice trembling slightly. Kale hesitated, his sharp features twisting in thought. Finally he spoke. "We will prepare for battle. But if we are to survive, we must fight together." The next few hours were a blur of frantic activity. The colonists worked alongside the Deathworlders to fortify the settlement, reinforcing walls and setting up makeshift defenses. Daniel and Vorn collaborated to modify mining drones into crude attack vehicles, equipping them with whatever weapons they could scavenge. Rachel translated basic commands into the Deathworlders' language, helping coordinate efforts between the two groups. Despite their differences, there were moments of unexpected cooperation. One evening, as Daniel tinkered with a drone, Vorn handed him a small tool that made the job easier. "Use this?" Vorn said gruffly, his tone less hostile than usual. Daniel blinked in surprise. "Thanks," he muttered, unsure how to respond. For a brief moment, the two shared a look of mutual respect before returning to their work. Elsewhere, Rachel and Emily worked tirelessly to decode fragments of the approaching fleet's transmissions. Using the Deathworlders' advanced equipment, they managed to piece together snippets of information. What they discovered chilled them to the bone. "They're planning to wipe us out?" Rachel whispered, her hands shaking as she held up the translated text. "No negotiations, no mercy." Emily clenched her fists, anger and fear bubbling inside. Why? What did we do to deserve this?" Rachel shook her head. "It doesn't matter. To them, we're probably just insects to be crushed." News of the impending attack spread quickly, sending waves of panic through the colony. Parents huddled with their children, trying to offer comfort despite their own terror. Others argued over whether they should surrender or fight to the death. Jacob did his best to keep everyone calm, but even he struggled to maintain hope. As the Armada drew closer, Kale gathered his warriors and addressed the humans. Standing tall and imposing, he spoke with a voice that commanded attention. "The enemy comes with overwhelming force," he said. "But strength alone does not guarantee victory. Together we may yet stand against them." His words struck a chord with the colonists. For all their fears and doubts, they knew Kale was right. Alone, neither group stood a chance. But united, they might have a fighting chance. The night before the battle, the atmosphere in the colony was tense but strangely quiet. People prepared in their own ways. Some prayed, others sharpened tools or checked weapons. Emily stayed in the communications hub, staring at the screens as the enemy fleet loomed ever closer. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a nightmare. Rachel joined her after a while, carrying 2 cups of weak tea. "You should rest," she said softly, handing one to Emily. "Tomorrow's going to be hard." "I can't sleep," Emily admitted, taking a sip of the lukewarm drink. "Every time I close my eyes, I see those ships." Rachel sighed, sitting down beside her. "Me too, but we have to hold on." "For the colony, for everyone?" Emily nodded, though she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep holding on. The stress of the past weeks had taken its toll, leaving her physically and emotionally drained. Still, she forced herself to focus. There was too much at stake to give up now. Outside, Kale stood atop a rocky ridge overlooking the settlement. His glowing eyes scanned the horizon, reflecting the dim light of Arcturus VII's twin moons. Behind him, his warriors waited silently, their weapons ready. For the first time since arriving, Kale felt a flicker of uncertainty. These humans were strange creatures, fragile yet determined. They reminded him of his own people in some ways, though their methods were vastly different. A soft hiss broke the silence as Vorn approached. "Commander," he said, bowing slightly, "the humans are ready." Kale nodded, his expression unreadable. "Good, tell them to conserve their energy. The real fight begins at dawn." As the first rays of sunlight crept over the horizon, the colony braced itself for the inevitable. The Armada filled the sky, blotting out the stars with its sheer size. Ships descended like vultures, their sleek designs glinting menacingly in the morning light. The ground trembled as they landed, kicking up clouds of red dust. From within the largest vessel, a figure emerged, a being clad in golden armor, radiating power and authority. Its voice boomed across the battlefield, amplified by unseen technology. "Surrender now, and your deaths will be swift. Resist, and you will suffer." Jacob stepped forward, his heart pounding. Beside him stood Kale, towering and unyielding. "We won't surrender," Jacob declared, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "We'll fight for our home." The golden-armored figure paused, as if amused. Then, without another word, it raised a hand, signaling the start of the attack. Chaos erupted as the enemy forces surged forward, weapons blazing. The humans and Deathworlders fought side by side, their combined strength holding the line against the invaders. Daniel piloted a modified drone, weaving through enemy fire with surprising skill. Rachel coordinated attacks using the Deathworlders' translation devices. Ensuring both groups worked seamlessly together, Emily remained in the communications hub, relaying critical information to the fighters on the ground. Her voice crackled over the comms as she warned of incoming threats. "Enemy reinforcements approaching from the east. Take cover." Amidst the chaos, bonds formed between unlikely allies. A young colonist named Lisa teamed up with a Deathworlder warrior, using her agility and his brute strength to take down multiple foes. Elsevera, one of Kale's lieutenants, shielded a group of children from a falling debris, earning their gratitude. Despite their initial fear of her, but the cost of the battle was high. Buildings crumbled under relentless bombardment, and casualties mounted on both sides. Blood stained the red soil as the fight dragged on, neither side willing to yield. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, a breakthrough came. Rachel, analyzing fragments of the enemy's communications, identified a critical weakness. "Their central command hub," she exclaimed, pointing to a massive ship hovering above the battlefield. "If we destroy it, we can disrupt their coordination." Kale wasted no time. Turning to Vorn, he issued a series of rapid commands. Vorn nodded and turned to Daniel. "You come with me," he growled. "Your machines, they help us reach the target." Without hesitation, Daniel followed Vorn toward the designated ship, climbing into a battered fighter craft. The battle raged across the skies above Arcturus 7, a chaotic symphony of explosions, screams, and the hum of alien weapons. The humans and Deathworlders fought side by side, their combined strength holding the line against the overwhelming force of the invading Armada. But despite their efforts, the enemy's numbers seemed endless, and the losses were mounting. Daniel gripped the controls of the battered fighter craft as it soared through the air, dodging blasts from enemy ships. Beside him sat Vorn, his sharp eyes scanning the battlefield with unnerving focus. The two had formed an uneasy partnership, but now they relied on each other completely. Their mission was clear: destroy the enemy's central command hub, the massive ship hovering high above the ground forces. Without it, the invaders' coordination would collapse, giving the defenders a fighting chance. "Stay low," Vorn growled, pointing to a cluster of smaller enemy vessels ahead. "Use cover." Daniel nodded, his knuckles white as he maneuvered the craft behind a rocky ridge. The ship shuddered as a nearby explosion rocked the air, sending debris flying past them. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. This wasn't like fixing machines or tinkering with tools. He was flying straight into the heart of the enemy's fleet. If they failed, everyone on the ground would be doomed. "We're almost there," Daniel muttered, more to himself than to Vorn. He glanced at the Deathworlder, who was crouched in the passenger seat, clutching a weapon that looked far too large for the cramped cockpit. Vorn's glowing eyes were fixed on the target ahead, his expression unreadable but intense. "Good," Vorn replied. "Now we strike." Back on the ground, Emily worked frantically in the communications hub, relaying critical information to the fighters. Her voice crackled over the comms as she warned of incoming threats and directed reinforcements to key locations. Around her, the colony was in chaos. Buildings burned and the air was thick with smoke and ash. Colonists ran for cover while others joined the fight, wielding whatever weapons they could find. Rachel stood beside Emily, her hands trembling as she held a clipboard filled with notes. Together they analyzed fragments of the enemy's transmissions, piecing together clues about their tactics and weaknesses. Rachel's mind raced as she tried to make sense of the data, searching for anything that might turn the tide of the battle. "There," Rachel exclaimed suddenly, pointing to a section of text on the screen. They're funneling reinforcements toward the eastern flank. If we can hold them off there, it'll give Daniel and Vorn more time. Emily nodded, quickly relaying the information to Jacob, who was leading a group of colonists in defensive positions along the perimeter. Jacob, you need to reinforce the east side, she said urgently. The enemy is focusing their attack? There, got it, Jacob replied, his voice strained but resolute. We'll hold them. On the eastern flank, the fighting was fierce. Jacob led a small team of colonists and Deathworlders using makeshift barricades to slow the enemy's advance. Bullets and energy blasts ricocheted off metal and stone. As both sides exchanged fire, the air was filled with the sound of shouts, cries, and the relentless roar of weapons. Among the defenders was Lisa, a young colonist who had never imagined herself in combat. She clutched a rifle tightly, her hands shaking as she fired at the approaching enemy. Beside her stood Elsevera, one of Kale's lieutenants, her towering frame shielding Lisa from incoming fire. Despite their differences, the two had formed a bond during the battle, working together seamlessly to protect the line. Stay close, Elsevera growled, her voice low and commanding. Do not falter, Lisa nodded, swallowing her fear. I won't, she promised, though her voice wavered slightly as the enemy pressed forward. Jacob shouted orders, directing his team to fall back and regroup. They couldn't hold the line forever, but every second they bought gave Daniel and Vorn a better chance of reaching the command hub. High above the battlefield, Daniel and Vorn approached the massive enemy ship. It loomed ahead of them, its surface bristling with weapons and defenses. The sheer size of it was intimidating, but Daniel forced himself to focus. He adjusted the controls, weaving the fighter craft through a hail of enemy fire. The ship shook violently as blasts struck its hull, but it held together, for now. We're almost in range, Daniel said, his voice tight with tension. Get ready, Vorn nodded, raising his weapon. His glowing eyes narrowed as he scanned the ship's surface, searching for a weak point. There, he growled, pointing to a section of exposed machinery near the ship's base. Aim for that. Daniel gritted his teeth, steering the craft toward the target. As they drew closer, the enemy ship unleashed a barrage of fire, forcing them to dodge and weave desperately. The ship groaned under the strain, its systems flickering as damage mounted. Hold on, Daniel shouted, pulling the craft into a steep dive. At the last moment, he released a volley of missiles, targeting the exposed machinery. The impact was deafening, a massive explosion that sent shockwaves rippling through the air. Flames engulfed the area as chunks of debris tumbled from the ship. We did it, Daniel breathed, relief flooding through him. But before he could celebrate, warning alarms blared in the cockpit. The fighter craft was heavily damaged, its engines sputtering. As smoke filled the cabin, we need to get out, Vorn said sharply, already unbuckling his harness. Now, without hesitation, Daniel pulled the craft into a sharp turn, heading back toward the colony. Behind them, the enemy ship began to falter, its systems failing as the destruction of the command hub disrupted the invaders' coordination. Ships in the fleet started to drift aimlessly, their pilots confused and disoriented. On the ground, the defenders noticed the change immediately. Enemy forces began retreating, their attacks growing less organized as confusion spread through their ranks. Jacob and his team seized the opportunity, launching a counterattack that pushed the invaders back further. They're falling apart, Jacob shouted, a note of triumph in his voice. Keep pushing. Colonists and Deathworlders alike surged forward, driving the enemy away from the settlement. The tide of the battle had turned, thanks to Daniel and Vorn's daring mission. As the dust began to settle, Kale surveyed the battlefield, his glowing eyes scanning the scene. The cost of victory was high buildings lay in ruins, and bodies littered the ground, but they had survived. For now, at least, the immediate threat was gone. Jacob approached him, his face streaked with dirt and sweat. We did it, he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. Together, Kale met his gaze, his expression unreadable. After a long moment, he nodded. Yes, together. Later that evening, as the survivors gathered in what remained of the colony, the mood was somber but hopeful. The battle had left deep scars, both physical and emotional, but it had also forged a bond between the humans and the Deathworlders. No longer were they strangers or reluctant allies, they were united by shared sacrifice and survival. Emily stood near the edge of the settlement, watching as Daniel and Vorn returned from their mission. Both were battered and bruised, but alive. She felt a surge of gratitude as she saw them, tears welling up in her eyes. Against all odds, they had succeeded. Rachel joined her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "We made it," she said softly. "But this isn't over," Emily nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "No," she agreed. "But we've proven something. Today, even when everything seems hopeless, we can still fight, we can still win." In the distance, the wreckage of the enemy fleet smoldered, a reminder of the cost of their victory. But for now, the colony was safe. And as the survivors began the long process of rebuilding, they knew they had found something even more valuable than survival. Fragile but unbreakable alliance that might just help them face whatever challenges lay ahead. The sun rose over Arcturus 7, casting a faint golden light across the battered colony. The red soil was stained darker in places, mixed with ash and blood from the battle that had raged the day before. Smoke still drifted lazily into the sky from smoldering wreckage, and the air carried the acrid smell of burnt metal and scorched earth. It was a scene of devastation, but amidst the ruins, there was a sense of quiet determination. Jacob stood near the edge of the settlement, surveying the damage. His face was lined with exhaustion, and his hands were caked with dirt, but his eyes reflected a flicker of hope. The colony had survived, barely, but now came the hard part. Rebuilding would take time, effort, and resources they didn't have. Still, he reminded himself, they had made it through the worst. That counted for something. Nearby, Emily sat on a pile of rubble, staring out at the horizon. Her blonde hair was matted with dust, and her clothes were torn, but she didn't seem to notice. She was replaying the events of the past hours in her mind, the chaos, the fear, and the moments of unexpected bravery. When Daniel and Vorn returned from their mission, she had wanted to hug them both, but instead, she settled for a nod of gratitude. Words felt inadequate after everything they had been through. Daniel himself was nearby, leaning against a damaged drone and inspecting its battered frame. His hands moved mechanically as he tightened loose bolts and replaced frayed wires. The drone had saved lives during the battle, and he was determined to keep it operational. Vorn stood beside him, watching silently as the human worked. Though neither of them spoke much, there was an unspoken understanding between them now. They had faced death together, and that bond couldn't be broken easily. Rachel wandered through the settlement, checking on the injured and offering what comfort she could. Many colonists lay in makeshift beds, their faces pale and drawn. Some bore wounds from the battle, while others were still fighting the alien disease that had plagued the colony for weeks. Rachel knelt beside a young boy named Ethan, placing a cool cloth on his feverish forehead. He smiled weakly at her, and she forced herself to smile back, even though her heart ached. "We're going to get through this," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "We have to." As the survivors began cleaning up, Cale gathered his warriors in the center of the settlement. Their armor was scratched and dented, and some bore injuries from the fight, but they stood tall and proud. Cale's glowing yellow eyes swept over them, taking in their weary but resolute expressions. He knew they had proven themselves in battle not just to the humans, but to each other. "The enemy is defeated," Cale announced, his deep voice carrying across the group. "But this victory comes at a cost. Many of our brothers and sisters have fallen. We honor their memory by continuing to fight for survival, for strength, and for unity." His words resonated with the warriors, who nodded solemnly. Then one of them stepped forward, a hot-headed fighter named Zarn, who had always been skeptical of working with humans. "Commander," Zarn growled, his tone sharp, "why do we stay here? These humans are weak. They cannot protect themselves. What purpose does this alliance serve?" Cale turned to face him, his expression unreadable. For a moment silence hung heavy in the air, then he spoke. "Strength is not measured by size or power alone. These humans fought alongside us, risking their lives for a cause greater than themselves. They may be fragile, but they are resilient, and resilience. He paused, his glowing eyes narrowing. Is a trait worth respecting. Zarn scowled, but said nothing further. The other warriors exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement. Kale's leadership had always been respected, but now, after seeing the humans' determination firsthand, many of them were beginning to understand his perspective. Later that day, Jacob called a meeting between the colony leaders and the Deathworlders. The two groups gathered in what remained of the main dome, sitting on crates and scraps of metal. The atmosphere was tense but calm, a far cry from the hostility that had marked their first encounter. "We owe you our lives," Jacob began, addressing Kale. "Without your help, we wouldn't have stood a chance against that fleet." Kale inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the statement. "Your willingness to fight alongside us proved your worth," he replied. "But this alliance must go beyond mere survival. If we are to endure, we must work together, not as separate factions, but as one." The room fell silent as everyone processed his words. It was a bold proposal, one that required trust on both sides. But given everything they had been through, it no longer seemed impossible. Emily spoke up next, her voice steady despite her fatigue. "We need to share knowledge and resources," she said. "You have technology we don't, and we have skills you might find useful. Together we can rebuild stronger than before." Rachel nodded in agreement. "And we need to address the disease," she added. "If we can combine our efforts, maybe we can find a cure." Kale considered their words, then gestured for one of his warriors to step forward. The warrior carried a small device which he handed to Kale. "This is a sample of the pathogen," Kale explained. "Our scientists will analyze it. Perhaps we can create a solution." A murmur of relief rippled through the colonists. For the first time in weeks, there was a glimmer of hope, not just for survival, but for healing. Over the next few days, the humans and Deathworlders worked side by side to repair the colony. Buildings were patched up, crops replanted, and water systems restored. The Deathworlders shared techniques for growing food in harsh conditions, while the humans taught them about sustainable farming practices. Slowly but surely, life began to return to the settlement. Daniel and Vorn continued to collaborate, modifying equipment to improve efficiency. Their partnership had evolved into a kind of camaraderie, marked by gruff jokes and mutual respect. One afternoon, as they tested a repaired drone, Vorn turned to Daniel with a rare grin. "Not bad, for a human," Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. "Coming from you, I'll take that as a compliment." Elsewhere, Rachel and several Deathworlder scientists pored over data related to the alien disease. Using samples collected during the battle, they identified key components of the pathogen and began developing treatments. Progress was slow, but every breakthrough brought renewed optimism. Emily, meanwhile, focused on improving communication between the two groups. She created a simple translation guide to help bridge the language gap, and she encouraged colonists to interact with their Deathworlder counterparts. At first, the interactions were cautious, but over time, friendships began to form. Children played games with young Deathworlders, laughing and shouting as if they had known each other all their lives. Even Jacob found himself opening up to Kale. The two leaders spent hours discussing strategies for the future, sharing stories of their respective worlds. Though they came from vastly different backgrounds, they discovered common ground in their desire to protect their people. Despite the progress, challenges remained. Supplies were still limited, and tensions occasionally flared between individuals. On both sides, some colonists struggled to trust the Deathworlders fully, while certain warriors viewed the humans as liabilities. But these issues were addressed openly, with leaders from both groups mediating disputes and fostering understanding. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the colony held a small gathering to honor those who had fallen in the battle. Humans and Deathworlders stood side by side, lighting candles and sharing stories of the brave souls who had sacrificed everything. It was a poignant moment, one that underscored the bond they had forged. As the ceremony drew to a close, Kale stepped forward. His glowing eyes scanned the crowd, taking in the faces of the survivors. Today we mourn, he said, his voice low and steady, but tomorrow we build. Together we will create something stronger than any of us could achieve alone. The crowd erupted into applause, a mix of cheers and roars that echoed across the settlement. For the first time in months, there was a sense of unity, a shared belief in the possibility of a better future. Weeks turned into months, and the colony transformed. New structures rose from the ashes of the old, blending human ingenuity with Deathworlder durability. Crops flourished in fields once thought barren, thanks to innovative farming methods. The alien disease was finally brought under control, thanks to a combined effort from human and Deathworlder scientists, but perhaps the most significant change was the shift in mindset. No longer did the humans see the Deathworlders as invaders, nor did the Deathworlders view the humans as weak. They were allies, partners, and friends bound by shared struggles and a commitment to survival. As Emily gazed at the stars one night, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The galaxy was vast and unpredictable, full of dangers and mysteries, but for now they were safe. And together they had proven that even in the darkest moments, hope could shine through. In the distance, Kale joined her, standing silently as they looked up at the endless expanse of space. What happens now? Emily asked softly. Kale's glowing eyes reflected the starlight as he considered the question. Now, he said, his voice firm, we prepare. Whatever comes next, we will face it together. And with that, the unlikely alliance between humans and Deathworlders enter.